Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast. You're listening to an independent podcast focused on geopolitical risk to serve risk professionals and decision makers in specialty insurance markets, reinsurance, and beyond. I'm your host, David Benyon, and I'm joined this time by Sam Wilkin, Director of Political Risk Analytics at WTW. Sam is based in Washington, and his role at the global insurance broker sees him crisscrossing the globe. So he was actually in Istanbul when he joined me via Zoom to chat in late July. Sam previously served as Head of Business Research at Oxford Economics. He's the author of 3 books on geopolitics and political risk, and in 2017 and 2018, he was a visiting fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University in the United States. Now, the timing and the hook for our discussion is the recently published first half of 2024 edition of WTW's Political Risk Index. Headline conclusions from that report are that political risk has risen dramatically in the world, and, in a section written by Sam, that the international rules-based system is in decline. This is evident, for instance, when looking at bilateral investment treaties, BITs, under strain in a multipolar world, and we'll get into this. WTW also has a predictive model, analysing patterns in some of the world's most vulnerable countries, trying to project what might happen next. There's also WTW's 7th annual political risk survey, which found that nearly all of respondents, 96%, said they've invested in new political risk management capabilities this year, a repeat of the previous year's findings, as organisations seek to get a grip on a changing political risk environment. So, let's get into it. Sam, I've wanted to have you on the pod for a while, so firstly, just thank you for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Pleasure to be here.
We're primarily here to discuss the recent index report that WTW put out, Political Risk Index update. So do you want to just give a little bit of background to the report before we get into some more detailed questions?
Oh, sure. So there are 2 things with publications, flagship publications for the financial solutions team regarding political risk. One is the Political Risk Index, which comes out twice a year, covers 40 emerging market countries with complete profiles and is accessible at no charge. And the other thing is Political Risk Survey, which I think we've been doing annually for 7 years now.
We'll definitely pick up on both of those today. We'll start with the index, but we're going to get into the survey too. Certainly when I was writing up a news story about this report, the headline was a story of decline of the rules-based order. But before we get to that, let's go back to the 1990s, even the Cold War era before it, and just look at why was the rules-based international order so successful, and perhaps how has the narrative changed for explaining that success?
So there's a simplistic view that the strength of the rules-based order came out of the barrel of a gun, an American gun specifically, and it is pointed at anyone who didn't follow the rules. And actually in the colonial or immediate post-colonial era, there were cases where the United States or other Western countries intervened militarily in pursuit of their, in some cases, even their companies' commercial interests. There were certainly cases where coups or revolutions or other changes of government were fomented in an effort to protect foreign direct investment. But actually, the rules-based order didn't grow out of the barrel of a gun. In fact, it really didn't exist. It was called the Liberal International Order when I was in school. So the success of the rules-based order was based on the absence of competition. So even during the Cold War, there was certainly a Western order, but it really didn't become an international order, liberal international order, rules-based international order until after the end of the Cold War. And the reason for that is because the absence of competition was crucial. So the rules-based order works on what international relations scholars usually call a club goods strategy, which is to say, if you were willing to follow the rules, then you could join the club. But you had to follow the rules to join the club. And if you violated the rules, you were kicked out. So let me give you an early example. And it was an early example because I think it was one of the first examples when people realized just how powerful this strategy might be. So the example is Malawi in the early 90s. They have a military coup. And the U.S. and all members of the Western International Order cut off foreign aid to Malawi at a stroke, reducing the country's annual economic output by close to 10%. And within a few months, the generals had agreed to restore democracy in Malawi. And the reason this worked is because there was no competition. You know, back in the Cold War days, Malawi could have turned to the Soviet bloc, perhaps to get a replacement for its foreign aid. Maybe the United States would have been reluctant to even try to put that much pressure during the Cold War days because they'd been afraid that Malawi would flip over to the Soviet side. And now it doesn't work again. Again, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because China's out there offering aid, or Russia's out there offering security guarantees or mercenaries or military equipment. But during this period, during this heyday of the liberal international order, it worked because there were a group of Western states largely in agreement about things. Those Western states controlled essentially all the world's, maybe 80% of the world's economy, so access to the world's consumer markets. They controlled essentially all of the world's foreign aid, all of the world's foreign lending. It's international security guarantees, its military equipment. If you wanted any of those goods, those club goods, if you wanted any of those access to any of those goods, you had to play by the rules of the order. And the result was that the order was really able to transform the world. In fact, kind of the magical thing about it was the transformations were greater the farther you got from the center. So life in the West, maybe didn't change all that much from the Cold War days, but life in the rest of the world changed a huge amount. And you went from like 40% of the world's population under democracy to 70+%, maybe 60 democracies to 120 democracies. At the time, we sort of thought of this as the end of history and all problems being solved. No one can think of I'm exaggerating a little bit, but no one can think of a better system than democracy or capitalism. But in retrospect, a lot of that came out of this absence of competition for the Western order, the liberal international order, which made it into a truly international order.
And now we get to the part where, frankly, things all go a little bit haywire. Now we're in a multipolar world. So what are the primary reasons you see as being behind the decline of the rules-based order?
I guess the obvious one is competition, right? Now you can go to 2008, maybe China's aid abroad exceeds U.S. aid. In 2010 or 11, it exceeds the entire aid budget of the G7. At that point, countries, especially under Belt and Road, you can go somewhere else to get aid. And so willingly, there's actually academic researchers have shown that the World Bank actually dials down the conditions it attaches to its loan whenever China is lending to the same country. So, there's an alternate view that U.S. military power has declined rapidly, but we've seen the U.S. go out and try to restore freedom of navigation, for instance, with the Houthis in Yemen. There's an argument that China's in the U.S. national security strategy, that China's trying to remake the world in its authoritarian image. That, again, doesn't seem to be what's happening. What's happening is really the amount of leverage that recipient countries have, is just dramatically increased. The amount of leverage the West has over to reshape the rest of the world's politics and economics has dramatically decreased. And so you've seen the core rules of the rules-based order, whether that's international peace or promotion of electoral democracy or protection of foreign direct investment, you've seen that begin to decline. Economists often talk about equilibriums. So thinking back to the podcast you just did a little while ago on the multilateral system, the multipolar world, and impact on finance, in a world where everyone was being really, really nice to foreign direct investors, you had to do something truly amazing in order to attract foreign direct investment to stand out from that kind of crowd. In a equilibrium where everyone's being really mean to foreign investors, or at least states are protecting their interests over investor rights or prioritizing national security and other interests over investor rights. In a world where people are being mean, you don't have to do that much to stand out anymore. And so it's in addition to the strength of the rules-based order and that the leverage that the West has over the rest of the world declining, you're also having this shift to a different equilibrium where things are getting a lot harder for foreign investors.
I really like the example you referred to in the index of the journalists tracing the assumed conspiratorial impact of bilateral investment treaties, BITs, in influence on government. For the benefit of the listeners, do you want to give a bit of a recap on that?
Yeah, so it's always a delight especially when you work in a kind of an esoteric field like political risk or investment, protecting foreign direct investment. When you work in a field like this, it's so rewarding to see someone stumble across your industry and your life and take an interest in it. And I found this book can't remember how, I think Amazon recommended it to me. I mean, maybe it was the Piketty book that caused this. It was a book called Silent Coup, and it was about bilateral investment treaties. And the journalist, it was from the Center of Investigative Journalism. They are definitely on the left. They're kind of hippies, and they go out and they try to uncover the world of investment insurance and investment bilateral investment treaties, and they cannot figure it out. They are absolutely dumbfounded. They say it's because there's a sort of secret insurance protecting the interests of capitalists, that's there, and foreign direct investors, capitalists. There's a sort of secret insurance protecting any interests of the foreign direct investor, past, present, or future, and that is these bilateral investment treaties. And it is true when you look at it from their perspective. I hadn't really done that before. When you look at it from their perspective, it was kind of amazing at the peak in a world where people were really, really bending over backwards to attract foreign direct investment and having to do a tremendous amount of work to stand out from the next country. In that world, you had foreign investors with the power to overturn all sorts of national legislation, powers they never had in their home countries. So, I mean, maybe it even got a little out of control, right? You had climate policies that were overturned. You had nutrition policies designed to protect children that were overturned. But you had this world. It didn't always work, right? I can certainly think of instances in the renewable sector where action under the bilateral investment treaty didn't work very well, or took forever, or ended up being negotiated. But it did work in this truly remarkable way, at least for a time. And it's fun to see this investigative journalism, because their investors had so much power. They're looking for a conspiracy. And of course, there was a conspiracy. It was called the Liberal International Order. And it was the West had a tremendous influence over countries around the world, and ability to demand free trade and protections for foreign investment and foreign investment liberalization, not necessarily in a malicious way. I think many of us in the West thought we were helping the rest of the world, bringing democracy to the rest of the world through this kind of influence, helping countries to develop. But at the same time, seen through a lefty kind of lens, it really is otherworldly just how much power and how the companies were able to go global with, in some cases, taking far fewer risks than they would take just in their home market because of these kind of things like the bilateral investment treaties.
Now we have the global south as an emerging power block, and the power of bits is changing. So you trace this in the index. There are fewer of them in force than there used to be, right?
So there are technical reasons for this as well. I mean, it looks apocalyptic. So the number of new bilateral investment treaties versus the number that are going out of existence, I think the ratio is now 5-1. It's gotten kind of worse and worse and worse over time. And now there are 5 times as many treaties expiring as there are being signed. And the ones that are being signed are much less favorable to foreign investors. They're new style treaties. And like I said, it's a different world where you don't have to work as hard to try to stand out from the crowd to appeal to foreign investors. But there is a technical element to this, and that is that a lot of the EU treaties are being replaced by a common EU framework, and so that makes it look worse than it is. But so don't sell everything. Don't sell everything just yet. But sure, it is definitely a different world, and it is much more difficult for foreign investors to protect their rights.
Okay, so let's talk about the survey that accompanies the index. That's the bit that's not all publicly available. But let's start with just who you're surveying and what it asks.
Yeah, so this survey has become a very interesting document over time. It's a client survey, so it's not a huge sample. It's 50 companies, but then we conduct in-depth interviews, which often are more interesting, between 10 and 15 companies each year. Because it's a client survey, it's often the same or close to the same body of people answering the survey. And so for doing it for 7 years, it's a very interesting historical moment, right? It's this transition from this unipolar moment to this multipolar moment, and a transition from a very stable world for foreign investors to a much less stable and much more unforgiving world for foreign investment. And we're asking companies about, what kind of political risk losses they're suffering, what are they doing to manage political risk, that kind of thing. What kind of political risks are they concerned about? And so it's very interesting to see how their perspective has shifted as the world has shifted.
I think it's worth saying for a moment that the reason why it's behind a paywall is clearly because you are part of this Illuminati.
The conspiracy, the global conspiracy. Well, I'll tell you what, actually it is. So there are some elements behind the paywall, but the main survey itself is free. You can access the political survey just, I think, for the cost of putting in your email address, but the main survey is free.
In the survey, how are you seeing companies' boards, their management strategies responding to increased political risk, especially in previously stable or otherwise attractive business environments?
Well, okay, so you have hit the nail on the head there. That's been actually the biggest shift. But there are lots of different shifts, right? So in the early 2019, 2018, usually it was between 15 to 30% of companies would report a political risk loss. Now we have usually 70 to 90% of companies reporting a political risk loss each year when we do the survey. There are other changes, but the nail on the head moment there was back in 2020, as recently as 2020. I think 2020 was the last year where this is really clear, maybe 2021. Any losses, political risk losses, were in countries that were, number one, obviously risky, like the 2020 top five: Iran, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Angola, Argentina. These are obviously risky countries. They're also small economies. If you went into those countries, you probably did it because you thought there was some amazing return you were going to get that was going to justify the risk. If you were a fool and you went and you didn't realize those countries were risky, then they were at least small enough that it really wasn't going to impact your bottom line all that much. And now what's happening, the top five countries, maybe around 2022, 2023, it starts to change, 2024, it's still changing. The top countries: Russia, China, India, Brazil, United States for all the sanctions. The Red Sea was a write-in this year because I think a lot of people had disruptions in the Red Sea, of course. But now it's very large economies that are stable. It's countries where businesses are doing business, and they're not businesses that are looking for political risk. There are businesses that were thinking the liberal international order, maybe they didn't call it the liberal international order, but they were thinking that world that was safe for foreign investors was just going to be there, and so they could do business all around the globe, regardless of politics. There's a great quote from the survey. Up till last year, business and politics lived in two different worlds. The events of the last year have brought those worlds together. Paraphrasing, but that's the basic idea. And so you're now seeing companies taking losses in countries that are big markets, and so it really impacts the bottom line. And they're also taking losses in countries they thought were very stable and attractive investment environments. So that's completely changed the sort of picture of political risk. Your second question about how companies are responding, there's a lot of that in the survey, of course, and we look at different risk management techniques. One of the things I thought was most interesting from this year's survey and comparing this to last year was last year, 100% of companies, and this year, I think 96%, said they added new capabilities to address geopolitical risk. I don't think I've ever seen 100% response to any survey question anywhere. So, this is clearly a time when companies have realized, maybe it took a little while, but they've realized now that there's an issue and they need to address it. Most popular techniques for addressing it are things like corporate process enhancement, which obviously could be something very small, or it could be something that doesn't cost very much. But then there are a lot of new hires, new cross-functional teams also. Last year, there was a huge emphasis on financial methods for addressing political risk, hedging and risk transfer. I think that was because 2023 was a standout year in terms of just sheer cost. We had 1 in 5 survey respondents saying they had a loss that was a material loss sufficient that they had to restate earnings. I think the Financial Times and Reuters did some calculations. It came up with roughly the same figure, which is about 100 billion lost as a result of the conflict in Ukraine. That's on the order of the most expensive natural disasters in history. So that was an expensive year. I think hence the emphasis on financial measures. We're seeing that changing a little bit now, where companies are facing more on tracking political risk and hiring new people. But still, I guess 2023 was a real shock in terms of corporate responses to political risk.
Yeah, the whole notion that two worlds colliding, of the world of politics and that of finance, economics, society, insurance markets as part of that is, well, frankly, on one level, it's the whole raison d'etre for this podcast.
Oh, that's right. It's right.
And then the other thing I'd pick up on, I mean, obviously, when you say that among those many things that management can bring in terms of actual practical steps they can take, you mentioned, new hires and adding talent. I just thought I'd bring in your own role in this regard, because just talk about what you do at WTW for a moment, because you are part of those conversations, right? You're kind of brought into the room to provide geopolitical risk expertise that perhaps for the same conversation just a few years ago, there would have been no call for that.
That's right. So lately, there's been a little travel. Well, I'm right now in Istanbul. So I basically have a few different roles at WTW. One of them is certainly giving presentations on geopolitical risks to our clients or having discussions, working through scenarios around geopolitics. And lately, there's been a lot of interest in boards of directors. I think there's been 5 invitations to talk to the board over the past year or so, which is unusual for me. As you know, I usually work with risk managers. So that's a big shift. And then the other thing I do is thought leadership, like the index and survey. And then I do analytics, which is where we're trying to quantify the impact of political risk. And we've done this a long time now, mostly relying on historical claims data in order to do the quantification. But now you're seeing people trying to, and there's a lot of initiatives here where people are really getting interested in, okay, how can we quantify other elements of political risk as well, things beyond what's insurable? We're seeing all sorts of new challenges emerging from the conflict in Ukraine, from the supply chain disruptions that occurred as a result of the conflict in Israel, some easier to manage and some really hard to manage. If you're a company that has a China supply chain, well, you can there are things that are very obvious to do and diversification. If you're a company that has a big China operation, it's extremely profitable. We find these companies just going back and back again to this question, what should we do about this? And, you can understand that there's risk there, but then do you take proactive measures or do you wait till something happens? If you take a proactive measure and nothing happens, are you then a fool? These are very difficult questions for corporate boards and companies to answer. We did a little word cloud of our interviews. We did a little word cloud from the interviews from the survey, and it was China just came out and completely dominates this word cloud. It's a real challenge.
From all the conversations I have, I just don't think there's a straightforward answer there. I just don't think that there's a palatable answer a lot of the time.
I tend to agree with you. Yeah.
If you were so used to imagining, I would argue it never was the case anyway, that you were able to operate in a vacuum without political risk being there and just busy collecting, fees, premium from a Beijing office. I mean, that's all well and good, but you were operating under a potentially flawed assumption to start with, and just because the bubble has burst doesn't mean you were ever right in the first place.
Yeah,
it's just an awakening of a new era we're in.
It is. I think there are ways to do it worse and better. And, it's been interesting for me. I've sometimes been dragged into the ERM consulting teams practices, and companies struggle with, well, if there's a crisis, so, we're thinking through a scenario, right? And if there's a crisis, one part of the company wants to do X and the other part of the company wants to do Y. So trying to make sure different responses from different parts of the company aren't undermining the interests of the parts of the company's strategy is a real challenge. So there, even if it's ultimately an unsolvable question, what to do about country X, there are ways to think through it and ways to prepare. And hopefully, if the worst happens, to make the response at least more coordinated and more effective.
When I was looking at the index initially, it was interesting to look at those different categories of countries that you would define as, sort of whether they were regional powers or friendly critics or opportunists or committed reformers. I mean, it was interesting to see all those countries grouped in those ways. So based on the models and projections, which territories are you expecting to become more dangerous or politically unstable in the future? And an obvious sub-question from that was, what should companies or governments be aware of moving forward?
We created a model, and the conceit or the sort of central premise is, so whatever the direction of causality, and there's lots of arguments in the direction of causality, countries that are richer are more likely to be democracies. Countries that are better education are more likely to be democracies. Countries that are oil exporters, export a lot of oil, are less likely to be democracies. So there are certain statistical regularities. And so we created a bunch of models that looked at different elements of the rules-based order, everything from level of democracy to protection of intellectual property rights, or even adoption of a single global standard, like a global business standard, like ISO 9000, or will there be multiple competing standards, or will there be a single standard? So we created some statistical models that try to look to a future without the influence of the rules-based order and say, where are the risks? Which other countries will change, right? We've seen, so for instance, we've seen in sub-Saharan Africa, I started with this example of a coup in Malawi where the threat of cutting off access to the club goods, cutting off access to foreign aid, was able to restore democracy in Malawi. So there were less than one successful military coup a year over the past 30 years on average. There have been, I want to say, 9 coups in 7 countries, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, since 2000. And not one, as of right now, not one of these coups have been followed by the restoration of democracy. So that's, again, symptomatic of the declining rules-based order. So then we looked at these indices or statistical models trying to say, well, where else might democracy be at risk? Where else might intellectual property rights or investor protections be at risk? And we found that there's a lot of concern in Latin America, both about level of democracy and about certain elements of investor protections. And we saw recently, just a few days ago, as of this recording, just a few days ago, a coup attempt, I think, in Bolivia. Other parts of sub-Saharan Africa might be at risk, Southeast Asia. And one of the things that we looked at, and this is an open question here, one of the things that the model says is that Eastern Europe is substantially at risk on indicators like trade freedom, investment freedom, and intellectual property rights, and even democracy. And you say, oh, Hungary, okay, well, there maybe Poland before and under the previous administration. Yeah, maybe these are some examples. But then the question is, a lot of those things were determined not by I don't think anyway, we're not determined by the liberal international order or rules-based order writ large. They were determined by the influence of the EU and the EU accession process. And so interesting, is that influence beginning to decline? Maybe it is. You're starting to see some states like Hungary play off East and West against each other, feeling that they have a much better bargaining position now. But will that liberal international order, rules-based order decline start to impact the east of the EU as well? Well, the model thinks it will, but alternately, another way to read it is glass half full, right? And another way to read it is these are the countries where the rules-based order is effectively still strongest.
Let's round off with a kind of summary statement. Let's return to the central premise of this index and the report that this is a system in decline. Would you say it's a terminal decline? Or what do you think comes next?
Okay. Well, this probably gets beyond my area. I'm a humble geopolitical risk advisor. Certainly my friends who work in national security in DC, I'm normally based in Washington, DC, they ponder this issue constantly. So in the index, current edition of the index, as you mentioned, we put countries into different categories. And two of the most geopolitically significant categories were the emerging regional powers. Those countries like Saudi Arabia or Turkey are conducting military interventions on their own account, under their own initiative. That is creating a lot of tension with the rules-based order and the way, the previous interventions that were Western-led were intended to work. It's obviously a shifting world. Another geopolitically significant, probably the most geopolitically significant category was the rising new order. Countries that are proposing reforms. They're not against the rules-based order, but they're proposing reforms. And sometimes these reforms are so drastic, it does make you question whether they would undermine the order itself. Some things like South Africa, obviously questioning a lot of the development international finance institutions' role in Africa and pushing back a lot against the way those institutions are run, or taking Israel to court. This is very, in some ways, it's a very much a rules-based order kind of thing. But in other ways, it's something that I think has created a lot of trouble for the core states of the West. But the biggest one, though, of course, is the BRICS and China. And the question is the BRICS. I mean, there's lots of reasons to suppose not. India and China trying to agree on anything is one of them. But is the BRICS the foundation of some kind of alternate world order or alternate order that will then be a competitor to the rules-based order? That's far from the case right now. We're seeing a weakening order, maybe not a collapsing one. You mentioned terminal. It may end up being more limited to the West and with lots of states on the periphery of the West, playing the sides off against each other, creating endless headaches. But we're far from that now. We're still one international order at the moment. But when it's pushed, like violent conflict or the pandemic and the push on international trade, free trade, a lot of decline. We saw a lot of decline in trade freedom shortly after the pandemic. When it's pushed, the rules of the order are not as solid as they once were. So not collapsing under its own weight or anything like that, but when pushed, it's certainly not as solid as it has been. And I think that's going to be the reality that businesses have to live with. It's a kind of a transition risk, if you will, right? You have climate transition risk, and now you have rules-based order transition risk, where we're transitioning to a different world, and companies that are highly globalized and globalized under assumptions about the prevailing order are now facing a transition risk where they're trying to move to this new world order and not sure if they're going to get it right.
Sam, thank you very much for deeply insightful, fascinating conversation, as I expected it to be, but wonderful to have you on the podcast. A pleasure. Thank you very much.
Pleasure for me as well. I've listened to many of the episodes and I've enjoyed them greatly.
And that's about all for this episode. I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank my guest, Sam Wilkin from WTW. We'll be back for one episode in August, and then back for the usual 2 per month from September. See you next time, and thanks for listening. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin made the music.